So Adi, as an undergrad, was a biology and environmental studies double major. And I got to know Adi because he took my tropical ecology and conservation class. And it was during that class I got to see his real passion for the planet and his passion for climate and his passion for the environment. And I distinctly remember a bus ride from one field station to the other where he wrote a poem and he read it out loud to everybody on the bus. And it was a plea for action to fight climate change. And so if you look at his background, you might notice, if you were to dig into the archives at Tufts, and I'm not sure if they really exist, but Adi was very active in trying to fight against climate change. And that action was clubs, it was internships, and then after he graduated, he went to DC and did more climate action. But he found himself being pulled back to the Northeast and wanting to work locally. And so he came back to MIT and did a master's in city planning and then from there has had a number of different sort of jobs. All of them are really around people and pedestrian safety and our relationship to the environment. And he's moved through a number of different jobs, and he currently is working for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And that might not mean very much to you, but if you follow the news at all, it's actually kind of maybe hidden in some of the articles that you might have read. So Milton votes down rezoning in order to build housing near MBTA stops, and Needham just did the same thing. Well, this was all sort of based on the state decision that we should have more planful planning in order to get people to places easier and to make more affordable housing. And this has been something that Adi has been working on a lot in the last couple of years. And he's also worked locally. And I couldn't be more pleased to welcome you back to Tufts. Thank you. And please join me in welcoming Adi Nochur.
Can folks hear me? All right, well, thank you so much, Colin, for that very generous introduction and for the invitation to be part of this lecture series, and to Coco and Sinet and the whole team behind the program here. It's just such an honor to be back on the Tufts campus and to tell you a little bit about what I've been up to in the 20-ish years since then. Who's really counting, right? But yeah, so I'm a senior transportation planner at MAPC, as Colin mentioned, and I'll say a bit more about that as we get into the presentation today. Colin mentioned the poem. It's funny because he and I didn't coordinate on this, but I'm actually going to start off with that because I think, you know, as environmentally minded people, we're good at presentations, right? We're good at data, we're good at talking about policy, but sometimes we're less good at telling stories. We're less good at connecting with folks on a heart level. How do we motivate people to action? It takes different ways of reaching people and communicating with people. And so I'm going to share this poem that I wrote back in 2005, right when I was first starting to get active on climate issues here on the Tufts campus. And it's called The Earth Grows, and it's kind of about what sort of future do we want to see. So I'll let it speak for itself. The earth grows warm as our hearts grow cold, and lies are traded and bought and sold. We can no longer accept what we are told. We need a new vision, something bold to transcend false reality and learn to breathe free, and create a world based around you and me. Not corporations and politicians repressing liberty. It's time to speak together as one community because global warming is looming as a threat every day. CO2 makes our world hot and melts it away. And we the people suffer and choke on the ashes of the toxic fumes and the greenhouse gases. But in Washington, DC, they're denying the facts as the government and oil companies sign business pacts. And as they try to keep the black gold flowing fast, they show just how much they're stuck in the past. And now they keep trying to drill offshore. The latest chapter in the never-ending war on our environment, destroyed, devastated, degraded. The assault on our land continues, blind and unabated. Poisoned atmosphere, we have much to fear as global warming's effects become more and more clear. The diagnosis is in, Mother Nature is sick. The time for action's now, we've got to move quick. So know that another future is possible. One based on solar and wind and renewable energy, the key to setting us free from corrupt politicians and corporate hegemony. We need to start demanding these alternatives so that we, our world, and its creatures may live. Start locally in your community and ask yourself, what do I want for me? To live in a world sick and choked by heat, where insecurity manifests itself on the street, where the world's oppressed peoples cry out in vain because we have all become numb to their pain? Or to live in a world where we all come together, enjoying a stable climate and weather, preserving our environment as a natural treasure, and rediscovering our lives in spirits and pleasure? We're at a crossroads and the choice is ours. In this hour of darkness, we got the power. The earth grows warm as our hearts grow cold. When will we warm up to the earth? Thank you. Thank you all for coming to my talk today, everybody. No, so I will move into a bit more of a conventional slide presentation now. But kind of with that said, I wanted to use that to set the foundation, because what I'm going to share with you all today is really tracing my story, starting before I even showed up on the Tufts campus, my journey through environmentalism and where it's taken me. As Colin indicated, I've been fortunate to do a lot of different things in my career. The path hasn't always been as linear as one might expect, but I feel like I've been able to tie things back to climate and sustainability and equity at the end of the day. And for me, one thing that's served me well, and I hope will serve you all well as you move into your careers and think about your next steps, is how do you stay true to your values? And that can look different in different contexts, but as long as you can pull things back to what your values are, then you're setting yourselves up for success. And so I can continue to touch upon that and other insights as I trace this journey that I've been on and that all of you are now joining me on today. So let's go back to my initial inspirations for getting into this work. I grew up in the Boston area. I've been in this area my entire life, but my parents are from India originally, and I've always gone back to India to visit family. And so I'd spend a lot of time with that man in the middle, in the front of that photo, my uncle Ganesh, my dad's younger brother, who would regale me of stories of the environmental justice activism that he would do in India, in places like on the left. Does anyone recognize that photo on the left? So that's the abandoned Union Carbide factory in Bhopal in central India, where in December 1984, thousands of tons of toxic gas leaked out of that factory. Thousands were killed, hundreds of thousands more have been affected to this day. Dow Chemical bought out Union Carbide in 2001. The site still hasn't been cleaned up. People are still suffering. So this has been an iconic environmental justice struggle for over 40 years now. And my uncle was involved in supporting the victims of that gas disaster. Similarly, that photo on the right, that's the Sardar Sarovar Dam in the Narmada River Valley, again in central India. Massive hydroelectric dam that flooded out tribal communities. And my uncle was very active in the Narmada Bachao Andolin, one of the grassroots movements that was fighting for justice for the tribal communities. So this influence of my uncle Ganesh really rubbed off on me at a young age, and even as young as age 7 or 8, based on my time with him in India and hearing his stories and getting to go to some natural areas, I kind of decided, all right, I don't want to be a fireman anymore. I'm going to be an environmentalist like my uncle. This is going to be great. And so my uncle, for a few years, he was Greenpeace's campaign director for India. This is a picture of him taking a barrel of toxic waste from the Dow site in Bhopal, and they went to Midland, Michigan, the corporate headquarters, and put it out there. There's civil disobedience. He got arrested. So very much this rabble-rouser, my uncle, was a huge influence in my life. I actually wrote my Tufts admissions essay about him and that influence. So this is where the seeds really got sparked, that exposure as I was growing up as a young kid. And even though I've never been to the Narmada River Valley or Bhopal, these places always loomed large in my imagination. And so I came to the Tufts campus knowing I wanted to be an environmental studies major. This was at the time when environmental studies was only offered as a second major, so I had to pick a primary major as well. And so I also picked biology and got to take great classes with folks like Colin, really digging in on ecology. But I still wasn't quite sure where I was going to take this environmental passion of mine. I had obviously been exposed to activism by my uncle, but I didn't know, okay, is this really a practical way to make a living? So I wasn't really sure where all this was headed. But I started taking some really interesting courses, was fortunate enough to take some courses in the UEP program. This was before they had the joint degree offering, which they do now, which I think is just great indication of how these issues are becoming more integrated over time. But as I was taking all this coursework, I was also getting involved with organizations on campus. And so at the time, the student group involved in environmental issues at Tufts was ECO, Environmental Consciousness Outreach. I don't think they're around anymore, but I started to get involved with ECO during my second semester of my freshman year. It just so happened that the week I showed up, the following week at another school in Cambridge just down the road, they were hosting the Northeast Youth Climate Conference. And I was like, okay, this sounds really interesting. Let me go check this out. And so I went to this youth climate conference, and this whole movement just emerged before me. It was youth from all across the Northeast, hundreds of youth from as far away as Ontario and Michigan, all thinking about how can we build this youth climate movement, bring it to scale. We as youth are going to be most impacted by climate change. How can we bring that moral voice to bear on our decision makers? And so I just saw this open up before me and just said to myself, oh my gosh, I must get involved. So I got active on campaigns here on the Tufts campus for a student referendum to purchase wind power, which was successful, a non-binding referendum. We got 74% of the campus to vote in support of that. But I was also very quickly getting involved with regional and even national networks of students getting mobilized on climate environmental issues, working with groups like the Sierra Student Coalition, the youth arm of the Sierra Club, Energy Action Coalition, which later became Power Shift Network. So this movement was really starting on the campus scale, but quickly scaling up beyond that to take on issues of state and national policy as well. So some of the photos up here on the left, I'm on a rally at the Boston Common as part of an International Day of Climate Action. We did an event called the Boston Coal Party, where we dumped mock coal on the Common and declared independence from fossil fuels. The photo on the right is from the Power Shift Convergence in 2007, where massive youth mobilization in DC for green jobs and climate justice. And as I mentioned earlier, I also got the chance to take courses in the UEP program with folks like Julian Adjaman. And I took his environmental justice class, and Julian knew I was very passionate about climate change and environmental issues. And so he propositioned me. He said, hey, Adi, instead of doing the course assignments, how about you help me write this book chapter for this upcoming movement volume on climate justice? And I said, are you kidding me? I get to co-author a book chapter at age 19, and it came out in that book with a lot of leading climate movement thinkers of the time, and I have a copy if anyone wants to take a look later. So a lot of really great formative experiences here on the Tufts campus, both through the coursework and getting exposed to planning and all sorts of interdisciplinary environmental issues, but also really diving into that activism, which for the first time really showed me that there was a pathway to make a living taking on these issues. So as I emerged from the program here at Tufts, I was just very passionate about all the climate organizing I was doing, and I wanted to move into doing that full time. So I actually, before I went into doing that work full time, I took a brief detour to the Massachusetts legislature. I worked for one of the state representatives who had been very progressive on climate and energy, amongst a whole host of other issues. And so I saw that as kind of a short-term measure. Maybe I'll be here for a year or two. I'll learn a bit more about the legislative process, the policy development process, learn about other issues besides climate. But then I want to take that political understanding back with me to future climate organizing work. So after working for the legislature for a little under a year, I was very fortunate that this opportunity opened up for me with the One Sky campaign. And so this was late 2007, early 2008, growing out of a number of longtime climate movement leaders who were coming together to sort of assess the state of the movement and what needed to be done. And so a lot of these leaders were coming together across sectors, not just the environmental sector, and they had a couple of different realizations. They realized, one, that a lot of really great work on climate was happening, but it was often siloed, it wasn't coordinated, people are sort of staying within their issue boxes, their sector boxes. So that was one challenge. And then the other challenge was that the solutions that were being advocated for didn't necessarily rise to the scale of what the climate crisis really demands. What does science and justice actually demand in terms of solutions? And so One Sky was founded as this big tent, bright line campaign that would unite people from all sectors of society in pushing for the set of solutions, what we called the One Sky solution. So we were calling for 5 million new green jobs. We were calling for 80% emissions reductions by 2050. And we were calling for a moratorium on new coal-fired power plants and fossil fuel development. So really trying to put these kind of what we saw at the time as visionary solutions out there and really unite folks from faith communities, public health, environment, labor, students, business organizations behind these solutions. So I was one of the first staff that was hired by this campaign. I eventually moved into a role as a national organizer and partnerships coordinator, helped build that network of over 650 allied organizations from all across the country. We organized days of action, rallies outside the White House, like you see in the middle picture here, where actually for a Mother's Day action, we invited people to paint blankets and murals of what climate change meant to them and send those into us. So, and then we displayed them outside the White House. You know, again, thinking about how do we bring in arts and culture and engage people in different ways, bring in people who might not ordinarily be part of the movement with new and creative tactics. We got to work with organizations like Green for All, pioneering leaders like Van Jones who are really elevating the cause of green jobs as a pathway and green jobs in a green economy strong enough to lift people out of poverty. So we organized a massive mobilization called Green Jobs Now in the fall of 2008, I want to say, kind of during that presidential campaign season, to really elevate these issues of green jobs. So I was in this national organizing position, working with folks all across the country at a state and local level to put pressure on members of Congress and then the presidential candidates, and then during the Obama administration to really think about how do we bring these bold federal climate solutions to scale. And then 2009 rolls around. Obama is in, Democratic supermajorities in Congress. And it's, oh my goodness, we have a window of opportunity to do something. We need to go after Congress with everything we have. And so in 2009, we got the Waxman-Markey bill. Our Senator Ed Markey was in the House of Representatives at the time, but was still very much a climate champion even then. We got this Waxman-Markey bill through the House by the skin of its teeth. It was a pretty compromised bill that a lot of us weren't necessarily excited about. There were a lot of giveaways to the fossil fuel industry as part of that legislation, but we did want to support it to see that it could hopefully be strengthened in the Senate. And then at the time, Senator Kerry took it on, also representing Massachusetts well. But despite his best efforts in the Senate, things got watered down even more, and the bill ultimately died. So I was, without even coming to a vote. So I was very fortunate to be in that position I was in DC for 2 or 3 years there, really getting this amazing experience organizing on a national level, this bird's eye view, being across the country. But then as the Tea Party took over Congress, that kind of killed the prospects for federal climate action. So being in DC was very empowering, but it was also very dispiriting, seeing how the political climates could shift, just seeing how entrenched some of the obstacles to progress were, how a lot of these corporate lobbies that we were fighting against still had sway. And so I came to a crossroads where I recognized that, okay, we obviously need smart and passionate people working in DC, but this has sort of run its course for me. I'm still very passionate about climate and energy and sustainability, but how can I reorient myself to maybe work at a bit more of a local level where there's more tangible prospects to make change? You're closer to the action on the ground. You're not kind of removed at this big national distant picture. You can actually engage with the change makers in a different way and see things happen in a different way. And so as I'd mentioned earlier, I had been fortunate enough to take some of the planning courses here at Tufts. And so I decided that I wanted to go back to grad school for urban planning and really think about what does it mean to build a clean energy economy from the ground up. So I was very fortunate to get into the program at MIT. So I moved back to the Boston area, to Somerville, and really came into this program at MIT with an environmental lens, but very quickly realized that just like environmental studies, urban planning is such an interdisciplinary field. There are people who are coming into the program who had previously worked as architects, as teachers, as housing advocates, and all of us were bringing our own individual lens and perspective to the table. But very quickly, we needed to figure out how we could learn from each other. How could we work across those different disciplinary areas? So that was actually one of the most rewarding aspects of the program for me in a way that was completely unexpected. I knew going to MIT, I'd get to work with great professors and take really interesting courses, but really being able to learn from my colleagues in this program who are coming in with all these different aspects of real life experience. And we're all kind of thrown together under this amorphous banner of urban planning and having to figure out how to work together and learn from each other. That was really rewarding. So with all that said, let's get a show of hands here. Question for you all. How many of you consider yourselves urban planners? Okay. How many of you live in communities? Okay, yeah. How many of you have opinions on how that community could be a better place to live? Congratulations, you're all urban planners. You just didn't know it, but now you do. So fundamentally, that's what urban planning, at least for me, is all about, right? We all live in communities. We want those communities to be better places to live. And planning is about how do we negotiate that? There's competing interests, competing pressures. We want to respect and bring communities into the process, listen to the lived experience of communities, but also bring our professional expertise to bear. So you all are planners, congratulations. There's much more we could dig in on there, but that was just, I think, a very fundamental realization that has, I think, served me well in my urban planning career. And so at MIT, I was able to take a lot of really interesting courses, some practicum courses working in neighborhoods like Dorchester, developing sustainability and equity plans, working with the city of Cambridge on energy efficiency pilot programs. So really getting to get some real world experience as well. And then I did my master's thesis on coal-fired power plant transition in Massachusetts. And so this is an image of the Salem Harbor Station in Salem, just north of here, which has retired. And so there are a couple of other communities in Massachusetts that had coal plants retiring, Somerset, Holyoke. And so there's this very real question of how are these communities planning for the redevelopment of those coal plant sites? And so I got to look at that with my master's thesis, really digging in on different stakeholder engagement frameworks and really proposing consensus building as a way to bring folks to the table and navigate those competing pressures for sustainable reuse of these formerly toxic coal plant sites. So got to do a lot of great work at MIT. And so coming out of that, I wanted to continue to think about what does it mean to work on sustainability and equity at a local level, clean energy and climate, what does that look like? And so my first position out of grad school, I was fortunate to get a position in Dorchester here in the city of Boston with the Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation. So they're do a lot of affordable housing development. They're a community development corporation in the neighborhood that's been there for over 40 years. And so they had a really cool, what they were calling an eco-innovation district initiative in the Talbot-Norfolk Triangle section of that neighborhood. It was a 12-block area where they're really looking at how to use sustainability as a framework to improve equity and quality of life in a historically disenfranchised low-income community of color. What does that mean? How can sustainability bring tangible benefits to people's lives? And so they were looking at a whole host of measures, everything from energy efficiency retrofits to opportunities for community shared solar and extending solar energy benefits to residents of the neighborhood, looking at opportunities for transit-oriented development along the Fairmount line, which is the only commuter rail line entirely within the city of Boston. For 40 years, trains just ran through the neighborhoods of Dorchester and Roxbury and Mattapan and didn't stop there. But due to grassroots advocacy, they built 4 new stops on that Fairmount line, which really opens up a lot of housing and development opportunities for residents that need it. And then also thinking about green infrastructure improvements in those communities, everything from better walking and biking infrastructure, street murals like you see outside a park here, traffic calming, better stormwater management, bioswales, rain gardens, rain barrels. So we were taking on a whole host of sustainability initiatives, and partnerships were key to making our work successful. We were a neighborhood-based organization. There was another faith-based community nonprofit we worked with. We worked closely with the city of Boston. And we also were working with national community development partners like eco districts and enterprise community partners. They're giving us a lot of really valuable frameworks and technical assistance to help us think about how we could better serve the residents of this Dorchester community. And so that's another through line that I would say has animated my career, is that partnerships at all scales are really critical to getting things done. So whether you find yourself working at the local level or the federal level or somewhere in between, you're ultimately going to be in dialogue with people at all scales. You need to find stakeholders at all scales across issues who are going to help you address the issues that you care about the most. And so that really came to bear in Codman Square. And so I worked in Codman Square for about a year and a half, and we got to partner with an organization called Walk Boston, which came into the neighborhood to do a lot of walkability assessments, looking at pedestrian infrastructure conditions. They were doing a lot of work with local neighborhood teenagers. So I got exposed to them and was looking for the next step in my career. And so I became a project manager with Walk Boston. And that was, again, an opportunity for me to develop a new skill set, learn about new issues. I had never worked on walkability before, never thought I would find myself working on walkability. And now I can't walk down the street without saying, oh, that traffic signal timing is off. That intersection is too wide. You really need to narrow that to slow the traffic down, or that crosswalk is deficient. It needs restriping. So these are the kind of nuts and bolts things when it comes to urban design and city design, but really have a big impact as far as livability is concerned. And very quickly, I got to see how walkability was connected to active transportation and transportation more generally, but again, with a whole host of other issues. Walkability is important for public health. It's important for having vibrant economies and local business districts. It's an environmentally friendly and climate resilient form of transportation. So I got to work in cities and towns all across Massachusetts, getting to go out to gateway cities, neighborhoods in the inner core of Boston, places in the state where I'd never been to growing up here, frankly, but really getting to dig on some of these unique challenges and help state agencies, community groups, consulting firms, again, thinking about how you work across different scales and sectors to really hone in on walkability at a local level, and also thinking about policy solutions like Vision Zero, some of you might have heard of, these frameworks that have started in Scandinavian countries that are increasingly being adopted by American cities. How can you arrive at a future with the vision of zero traffic deaths or serious injuries? So I got to really play an active role in that technical assistance provider with Walk Boston, and that was really how I got connected into a lot of the transportation work, which we'll speak about a bit about more shortly. But really just great overview to dive in. And here we are with a bunch of seniors in Mattapan Square doing a walk audit, an age-friendly walk audit, recognizing that seniors are particularly vulnerable demographic when it comes to walking, but if you can make it safer and more comfortable for seniors, you make it safer and better for everyone. So again, how do you think about reaching vulnerable populations, building equity into the core of this work? So after a few years at Walk Boston, again, I'm ready to take another step in my career. And then I found myself in a new role as the Deputy Director of Capacity Building at Groundwork USA. And Groundwork USA is a very interesting organization. It's a national organization with 20 local affiliates across the country called the Network of Groundwork Trusts. And right down the road, there's a Groundwork Somerville. There's also Groundwork up in Lawrence. So this is an issue of an image of the Spicket River Greenway in Lawrence. Historically industrial community, a lot of abandoned mill buildings that have been vacant. And now a lot of these corridors are being redeveloped into affordable housing, mixed-use trails, recreational opportunities. And so that was the work we were doing at Groundwork USA, is leveraging federal technical assistance programs through the EPA and National Park Service on brownfields, sites that have either historically been contaminated or where there's a perception of contamination. How can you redevelop those sites into something that benefits the community? How can you take these neglected and abandoned waterways and turn them into community assets, places that the community wants to be? How can you empower and revitalize communities through these initiatives? So I was in that role of Deputy Director of Capacity Building. I was helping support communities across the country with these technical assistance programs, helping support the network of Groundwork Trusts. Right here, I also got to do some work in the Mystic River watershed. There's a program that EPA has called Urban Waters Ambassadors, who are really looking at watershed scale issues, enhancing open space and stormwater management. So got to manage some stakeholder engagement as part of that. So a lot of really great work in our backyard, but also thinking about how folks can come together at a national level and share best practice. So again, thinking about how these scales can be in dialogue with each other. And one of the interesting things I'll also note was when I first joined Groundwork USA in 2019, it was during the first Trump administration. But even then, there were committed staff in the agencies who were able to get us the resources and funding that we needed to sustain those programs. I don't know what the prospects might be now, but hopefully that is indicative that even with the climate being what it is, there still are opportunities for progress at the federal level. And one thing I'll also say that I didn't mention earlier is that we're in again, in a similar moment where we're even 2008, kind of during the Bush years, we didn't see much prospect for federal climate action. So the idea was through action at the state and local level, states like Massachusetts, California taking progressive action, that would eventually force the issue at a national level. And it did work like that for a while, but now we're kind of again in a moment where things are kind of going back to the states and the localities. So thinking about how we engage at different scales to again force these issues when the time is right is something for all of us to think about. So so then the groundwork experience was also valuable, added another issue to my toolkit. I didn't necessarily think I would ever end up working on brownfields, but then again, there are very clear climate connections. There's a lot of resiliency connections to the work as groundwork was thinking about how they could make their neighborhoods more resilient, the communities they were working in. And so another great example of nonprofits on the ground doing the work. But I ultimately kind of find, at least for me personally, that the nonprofit sector and being in small nonprofits in particular was starting to get a little bit limiting in terms of what the career prospects might be. So again, I knew I was still passionate about sustainability and equity and climate, but wanted to reorient myself to think about what might it mean to take this work from a different sectoral perspective. What might it mean to work in the private sector or in the public sector, maybe for a state agency or for a municipality? So I kind of cast my net pretty wide, but was very fortunate to land up at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC. And so the MAPC is the regional urban planning agency for the greater Boston area. You can see our service area on the map over here, 101 cities and towns in the greater Boston area that we serve. And so we're a very interesting agency in a number of ways. We work to promote smart growth and regional collaboration, but we're also very deeply passionate about climate and equity. So we are a state agency, but we're not a regulatory agency, which means that we can't implement things ourselves. We need to lean on our partners in municipal and state government to help us out with that implementation. So we are kind of an interestingly situated public sector state agency. We're also very values driven in a way that a lot of state agencies aren't, or aren't as outward facing, but we are very intentional in terms of how we work with communities. We're directly working with communities. We are uplifting values of climate and equity. We do a fair amount of advocacy at the State House on different policy priorities. So in some ways, we do still have that kind of advocacy nonprofit streak alive, even though we are a state agency. And at the end of the day, we are serving the 101 cities and towns in the Boston area. So we work closely with community advocates, but ultimately our charge is to serve the cities and towns. So in effect, we're kind of like a consulting firm providing these technical assistance programs to these cities and towns. So in effect, we capture all of these different aspects of different sectors under one roof as a planning agency, which I think is pretty exciting. So it means we get to do lots of different things. And so we're guided by what we call Metropolitan 2050. It's kind of our policy vision for the greater Boston area. You can find it on our website. And again, speaking to the interdisciplinary nature of urban planning, I should say that MAPC, while I'm on the transportation department, we have pretty much every issue of urban planning represented under our roof. We have clean energy, we have environment, we have public health, we have housing, land use, economic development. So again, it's how do we think about working at the intersections of all of these issues. And so these are some of the key priority action areas that we lift up in Metrocommon: climate change mitigation and adaptation, dynamic and representative government. How do we make municipal services and municipal government more reactive, more responsive to the people that they serve? Homes for everyone. It's no secret that we're in a housing crunch in the greater Boston area. Colin alluded to this earlier, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. Equity of wealth and health. How are we making sure all communities have opportunities to thrive, economic opportunities, health opportunities? Everyone deserves to live in a safe and healthy environment. Everyone deserves to have access to economic opportunity. And then kind of most directly relevant to the transportation work I do, this category around inclusive growth and mobility. And of course, these are all cross-cutting and interconnected, but this is the one with sort of the most direct relevance to the work I do day to day as a senior transportation planner. So here's some of the recommendations from our Metrocommon plan that align with that inclusive growth and mobility category. How can we reduce vehicle miles traveled and single occupant vehicle traveled, and think about transit-oriented development and walkable centers? A huge part of the work that I do. How do we improve accessibility and regional connectivity, access to recreational spaces, cultural preservation? So these are all the values and goals that we look to uplift in the work that we do as a regional planning agency. And so just a little bit more about our transportation department. We do so many different things. Public transportation and parking management are two of the issues in particular that I've been able to take on during my time at MAPC. A lot more to say about that, but certainly electric vehicles, bike and pedestrian plans, greenways and trails, thinking about connections between transportation and land use, which again, I'll say more about, housing as well, and much more. And this graphic from the Federal Highway Administration, I think, brings a lot of these cross issue areas into focus as well. I don't think you could probably find this graphic online anymore. It mentions racism, so that's probably been taken down at this point. But in this graphic, it's a bit more road-centric than I might like. It is the Federal Highway Administration, but it does articulate how transportation does connect us to all of these different issues, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's environmental pollution, environmental justice, safety. Again, you think about how transportation is really at the core of our lives. How do we get from point A to point B? What does that journey look like? Is it safe? Is it accessible? Is it cheap? Is it comfortable? Is it sustainable? These are all the questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And so I would say that our work as a transportation department at MAPC is really about how can we decarbonize our transportation sector, and that's a lot of the electrification side of the equation, but then also how can we promote more multimodal transportation? How can we get people out of single occupancy cars? So what are the transportation and land use and housing measures that's going to take to support that vision of a more sustainable mobility future? So one of the fundamental things we're committed to is this principle of complete streets, which some of you might have heard of. Cities and towns all over Massachusetts have adopted this. This Massachusetts Department of Transportation, MassDOT, has a very robust complete streets program. And so fundamentally, it's about how do we create streets that are safe, comfortable, and accessible for all ages and abilities and all modes of travel. So whether you're a senior, you might be a person with disabilities who needs a mobility device to roll around, you might be a young child trying to get home from school, whether you're walking, whether you're biking, driving, or taking transit, we need streets that work for everybody. And so that's a big part of what animates our work. In complete streets, it's not going to look the same everywhere. You're not necessarily going to put a bike lane on every single street, but you do want to create bike networks that will enable people to get from one side of town to the other without being exposed to automobile traffic, or that makes it safe and comfortable for folks to get around, and encourage that mode shift out of cars and into these more sustainable modes of transportation. So complete streets is a fundamental principle that we as an agency and a transportation team are dedicated to. And we've been able to continue collaborating with Tufts. Colin alluded to some of this earlier, but how many of you have heard of the MBTA Communities Act? Okay, a couple of you. So this is a big part of what's animating our work at MAPC. A few years ago, the legislature passed a law that is called the MBTA Communities Act. You might also hear it referred to as Section 3A. And this is basically a mandate from the state that municipalities in the MBTA catchment area, there's 177 municipalities that are either directly served by the MBTA or considered adjacent communities in some fashion, need to zone for multifamily housing near transit. And now that's not a guarantee that multifamily housing is actually going to get built. It just means you need to change the zoning so that the multifamily housing could be built at some point in the future. So it's not going to make an immediate dent, but it's a really important first step in addressing some of the housing problems that have really built up over generations because the state has not produced enough housing to keep up with the demand. And so we've been doing a lot of work to help cities and towns comply with Section 3A. Most cities and towns have gotten on board. There are a few holdouts, Milton Needham, as Colin indicated. But we are really seeing this as an opportunity because it's not just enough to buy an electric vehicle. We need to create land use patterns that enable people to take transit, that enable people to walk and bike so that they don't need to be dependent on a car for their daily needs. So really, how do you get that transportation and land use and housing connection right is really integral to this. So how can we go beyond just the zoning compliance and actually think about how do these multifamily districts, how can they become thriving, livable, sustainable neighborhoods? And so this was the question that we put to a team of UEP field researchers as part of their field projects course last year. We came up with a proposal to really interrogate this question a bit further. After adopting these 3A zoning districts, what transit, climate, and equity policies can municipalities use? And so the students, with supervision from us, really put together a number of great proposals, really outlining some case studies and recommendations that municipalities can take on in the categories of multimodal mobility, parking reform, housing affordability, and climate adaptation and mitigation. And so this is a report on our website, and maybe we can figure out ways to share links after the fact for anyone who wants to read that. But just an example of how even now I've been able to keep the dialogue going with this campus in a way that's hopefully will continue to move the needle forward for some of the work we're doing. And so now parking. I'll spend a few minutes on this because I think this is work that I never, again, thought I would find myself doing, but I've really come to appreciate the value of this work at MAPC. And again, I would say ties back to another through line that's animated my career, is that I've always been excited to learn about new issues and found myself working on issues I never thought I would work on, but that I've become passionate about. So be ready to have your careers take you in unexpected but exciting directions, I would say. So parking, it might seem very mundane, but those of us who drive, it always animates kind of how are we getting around. And anytime a new development is proposed, parking is the third rail. It just kind of touches something in our collective lizard brains. People go nuts. So how can we shed some light on what parking actually means for communities? And it's really important that we get this right. You can see this image on the right, you have a multifamily housing development, you've got a parking garage for 15 cars. About a third of that parking is sitting vacant. There's a lot of it is underused. So how can we maybe envision a scenario that looks a little bit more like something on the bottom? You have a smaller parking garage. More of that parking is used. It gives you more space to build housing. You can dedicate more space to transit, to open space. So fundamentally, getting parking right matters for reducing housing costs. Parking is expensive to build, so that drives up the cost of housing. It also means that it takes up valuable space that you could use to build more housing or other community-focused uses. Also, the more parking you build, the more people are encouraged to park and drive. So that undermines sustainable multimodal transportation. It adds to congestion, it adds to pollution, it adds to greenhouse gas emissions. So really, we can talk about how do we transform our streets, how do we transform zoning, but really parking is really critical to getting a lot of this right as well. And it's been endorsed by none other than Henry Graybar. Some of you might have read his book, Paved Paradise. He's really emerged as a parking guru in recent years. And we had the opportunity to do a forum with him about a year ago where he really threw down the gauntlet for us. He said the approach to parking will determine whether the MBTA Communities Act succeeds. And so when you confront this trade-off between building more housing or building more parking, which one at the end of the day is really going to make a difference for the livability and sustainability of our communities, right? And you can again see this picture bring into focus just what kind of damage excess parking requirements have done for our communities. You can see in that top left corner, kind of more of a commercial main street where no parking is required. It's quaint, it's walkable, it's human scaled. Then as you kind of keep ratcheting up the amount of minimum parking that's required, you have more and more parking lots until at the end of the day, you're just left with a drive-through. And that's no one's idea of a fun place to be. So in terms of our parking practice at MAPC, I've been very fortunate to inherit our perfect fit parking work. And so this is a body of research work that began before I started at MAPC, but I've been very fortunate to build on it and take it in new directions. And so with this work, we wanted to understand how much parking is being supplied at these multifamily housing sites throughout the greater Boston region, how much parking is actually being demanded, and how much is being used. So we've looked at over 20 municipalities, nearly 250 multifamily housing sites. That's the website where you can find all of our reports and data. And what we found through multiple phases of this research is that parking is systematically overbuilt and underutilized throughout the greater Boston area, as almost 40% of the parking spaces supplied sitting vacant overnight in some of these surveys. So it's really showing that these cities and towns are requiring more parking than is necessary, and that's coming at a very real cost. It's coming at the cost of more affordable housing. It's coming at the expense of sustainable transportation. So this really showcases that we have an opportunity to right-size parking in our communities. And we've also statistically modeled this data and found that literally the single biggest driver of parking demand is parking supply. The more parking you build, the more people will park, the more they will drive. They might feel inclined to buy a car to take advantage of the free or low-cost parking that's provided on site. So really, how do we get this parking right is critical to advancing a vision of a sustainable community. And this kind of shows our broader data set throughout the greater Boston area. And it's really showcases how we can think about right-sizing parking in line with sustainable housing, transportation, and climate goals. And in the context of MBTA communities, we're seeing more and more communities embrace this mantle of parking reform. As Amy Dane, who's a local planning and zoning researcher, said in a recent Upzone Update newsletter last summer, she writes a lot about zoning and housing topics, and it's a great resource for folks interested in these topics, that MBTA communities has encouraged cities and towns to shrink their parking minimums. And we'd already seen cities like Somerville and Everett take this on, but now more and more places are taking this on. Even suburban communities like Acton, that might not be well served by transit, or Bedford are instituting parking maximums, getting rid of parking minimums. So we are starting to see really forward-thinking movement in places that you might not think would be open to this sort of reform, but increasingly they're confronting these trade-offs and really recognizing that parking is a barrier to affordable housing and that they need to take these issues on if they want to create places for folks to age in place or to move into the community or stay in the community where they might live but are maybe being forced out due to housing market pressures. So to also transition, a lot of the work I get to do is on public transit at MAPC. So how do we improve infrastructure and access and funding? And so, of course, a lot of the attention goes to the subway system, but there's a lot you can do with the bus as sort of low-hanging fruit. The bus is really the workhorse of the public transportation system, serves a lot of low-income communities and communities of color, both in the inner core of Boston and expanding out. And the bus is more adaptable. In terms of how you can change the routes, you could potentially change the service. And so we're increasingly seeing more and more cities and towns in greater Boston implement dedicated bus lanes. So you see that photo on the bottom right is Columbus Ave in Roxbury, where the city has put center running bus lanes. And now the city of Boston is interested in doing the same on Blue Hill Ave in Roxbury and Dorchester and Mattapan. And so these are the kinds of transit priority improvements, dedicated bus lanes, better signals that can make a huge difference for bus riders in terms of how they get around the region so that they're not stuck in traffic. They have a more comfortable ride, makes the bus a transit mode of choice rather than one of necessity, make it a more attractive option. So maybe more folks are, again, encouraged to take that mode shift. But of course, people continue to be concerned about issues like of parking. If you're going to take this parking on this major corridor to make a bus lane, what does that mean for the parking equation? Can parking be shifted to side streets or off-street parking lots? If you have more people taking the bus, does that mean the parking demand is reduced and maybe you don't need as much parking as you think you did? So we need to really think about our streets as an ecosystem, right? How do we reallocate street space to serve the people who are taking these transit modes, because oftentimes most people on a corridor like Blue Hill Ave are actually traveling by bus. They're not traveling in private cars. The majority of people are actually traveling in these congested buses. And then another piece that we need to be mindful of is as these transportation investments are coming into neighborhoods that have historically been marginalized and neglected, places like Blue Hill Ave, that are already facing housing and displacement pressures and are uniquely vulnerable in a lot of ways. How do you address that concern that, is this transportation project really for me, or is it just going to price me out of the neighborhood? Or am I going to be able to stay in this neighborhood and take advantage of that transportation investment? And so we really need to be able to shed light on those issues through data and stories that show that, our municipal partners are taking these issues seriously and are implementing policy measures that ensure that people in these communities can stay and stand to benefit from these transportation investments. So again, it goes to show how we need to think about all these holistically. It's not just about putting in the bus lane, it's about what are the broader impacts to the street and to the community writ large, and how do you navigate that? We're also seeing a lot of measures to improve, 4 minutes? Okay, I'll try and blow through this. We're seeing a lot of moves to improve transportation access and funding. MBTA has implemented a low-income fare program as of last year, which is terrific. That's something that we at MAPC advocated for a long time. We've also seen cities like Somerville step up and lead in funding free transit pass programs for low-income individuals using COVID recovery funds. And I actually got to do the evaluation of that program with the city of Somerville, which was just incredible. We did focus groups with people who are benefiting from these programs, and just the stories they shared about how these free transit passes were making transformative impacts in their lives in terms of their ability to take their kids to the doctor or to go to a museum. Just incredibly powerful stuff. We're also seeing interest in fare-free bus initiatives with regional transit authorities, the city of Boston taking this on. There's more funding from the state coming in through things like the Fair Share Amendment and the Millionaires Tax. But again, sustainable funding is a long-term challenge for how we sustain these initiatives. And so we're also working on transportation funding more generally. It's not just the MBTA that's underfunded. Some of you might have heard about the fiscal cliff, which is now being addressed by the governor. And so we've researched a whole number of transportation finance recommendations, and we're going to be continuing to advocate for those for the legislature and governor about how can we create systemic long-term solutions to our transportation funding issues. And of course, we have to heed the advice of the transportation advisor from SimCity 2000, which is where some of us might have cut our teeth in urban planning even before we were in college. And so, the progress, it can be a long uphill slog at times, but we also need to celebrate the wins. How many of y'all have ridden the new Green Line extension across the street? Yep, so this is when they opened the Union Square branch back in March of 2022, a few months into my tenure at the agency, got a piece of the ribbon. And so I'm there with Eric Barassa, who's our director of transportation at MAPC. That image in the middle is from the opening that December of 2022 outside the crowd. Maybe some of you were in the crowd that day. I know what the a cappella group sang in Cummings. It was just a fantastic event, just tons of energy for the new Green Line station. Some of you might have ridden the train at 4:30 in the morning when it first opened that day. And then took some photos and got retweeted by Congresswoman Presley to kind of put the icing on the cake. So, the progress can be slow at times. This Green Line extension, people were talking about it when I was at Tufts 20 years ago, but it goes to show that with persistence and ups and downs, the community continued fighting the good fight. There was at one point where it looked like the project might be scrapped altogether, but they held Governor Baker's feet to the fire, and now we have the Green Line extension. We have the fantastic community path extension that runs alongside it now through my neighborhood in East Somerville. So this goes to show that what we can accomplish when we put our heads together at a regional scale and dream big. And again, thinking about partnerships at all scales, you can see the tweet tagging the T, MassDOT, FTA, cities and towns, mayors, congresswomen, senators. So it really takes partnerships at all levels to get this done. And so with all that, I want to just thank you all for being here. And I've got one more poem I'm going to close out on quickly that I think hopefully puts a bow on all this stuff. And it's about how do we make change across scales. And it's called One World at a Time. One campus at a time, one city at a time, one state at a time, one country at a time, one world at a time. One world at a time when we are standing on the edge of a new beginning. One world at a time when we are rising to the challenge of a generation. I can feel this movement coursing through my veins as I gaze into the eyes of my brothers and sisters, knowing that we are all in this together, knowing that the bonds of solidarity will connect us forever. One campus at a time, one city at a time, one state at a time, one country at a time, one world at a time, we are making change and reclaiming our future. And we will continue to transform minds, one world at a time. And we'll continue to transform hearts, one world at a time. And we'll continue to transform lives, one world at a time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We do have time for questions, so I'll bring the mic to you if you have a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk today. I was just wondering, do you have any examples of policies or actions that have been taken to protect communities from gentrification and displacement kind of as a result of improved transportation?
Yeah, that's a big question that we're confronting right now, and that the city of Boston has really been confronting. So when we were working with them on the Blue Hill Ave project, we were kind of trying to provide a lot of data that kind of was grounded in the neighborhood reality and sort of presenting it to them in ways that they could think about packaging it for the community. And they didn't ultimately end up using that data in a public-facing way, but I think it helped them think about their broader approach to gentrification and displacement. And so there's, I think, a number of tools and resources that they've been putting out. I'm not fully up to speed on all the details, but I think certainly thinking about how you disperse city-owned lots for more affordable housing production is a big one. What kinds of tenant protections you can put in place at a municipal level is another. So admittedly, the housing side is not my area of expertise, but happy to follow up and send you some more information because I know the city of Boston has been putting a lot of thought into that and have some great resources and toolkits that are out there.
Any?
That was an absolutely terrific talk.
Thank you.
Some of your graphics were just like works of art. I'm a Somerville resident, and I was initially a supporter of the Green Line extension, as were many of my neighbors. But I was struck by the irony of just a little bit before the end of the talk, you mentioned how public transportation changes can have some unintended consequences. And I became no longer a supporter of the Green Line extension, unlike a bunch of my neighbors. And then the extension came through and they were renters for decades. And suddenly their rents got jacked up tremendously and they no longer live in Somerville. So any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does highlight how sometimes these things can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? And how do you sort of plan for those maybe unintended impacts? And back in, I want to say it was 2014, MAPC, this was before my time at the agency, actually did a report called Dimensions of Displacement along the Green Line. It was looking at the future of the corridor and what the potential risks could be. And so that was a body of research work that we did put together that was, I think very much part of the conversation. We were very much supporters of the Green Line extension, but we definitely do recognize that those consequences were there. Even at that opening celebration, there was a group of advocates who were out to kind of protest and call for the need for folks to stay in place and for the housing protection. So even at that opening event, those advocates had a presence, and I think it was noted and respected. So I think it does kind of behoove us as planners to think about how do we make sure that we are proactively thinking about these issues and mitigating that, because I do know the Green Line extension took so long to build. People are speculating on this back in 2000, 2005, and even then property prices were going up to the point where I think an assessment was done that the demographics of Somerville have changed so much in the time with all the delays that it's actually not serving as much of the low-income communities of color. It's sort of maybe a whiter and wealthier population than they thought it might initially serve, just given how the demographics changed before the extension even opened. So it's absolutely something we need to be thinking about and need folks in communities who are going to hold decision makers accountable to address that. So thank you for that question. Very important.
I'm looking at online. One participant wrote inspirational, great presentation, and poems. So Park Wild also texted in wanting you to sort of address aviation, the aviation issue that you've been dialoguing about over email. And aviation is responsible for 6% of Massachusetts carbon dioxide emissions, but aviation shows up as a zero in all city and town greenhouse gas inventories following MAPC's sort of protocols. And I'm just shortening his question, given that you've already thought about this, can you talk a little bit about sort of like how aviation does or doesn't, and how might it in the future be calculated in thinking about issues of CO2 calculations and sort of the benefits of one city plan or another? And in some ways, the cloud is also a big time CO2 user. And so you could imagine any number of different sort of topics that expand outside maybe a municipality's sort of typical limits. And how do you account for those?
Sure. Well, thanks, Park. I'm not sure if you're watching online, but Park, some of you might take his climate action class, which I'll say is, of course, I wish I had when I was an undergraduate, but that's neither here nor there. But Park has reached out to me about this question of aviation emissions and how MAPC does or doesn't count them within municipal greenhouse gas inventories, which is admittedly not my area of expertise. So I did reach out to a couple of my colleagues on the clean energy team at MAPC to dig into this a bit further. And as it stands, we don't count aviation emissions in our greenhouse gas inventories. There is some guidance on how municipalities might do so, and the protocol that our greenhouse accounting tool is based on does have some of those references. From what I understand, I think there are issues in terms of what are the data sources available that you would use to measure aviation emissions. You might not have the same kind of data set that you might for roadway emissions or things like that. So there's maybe a gap in sort of the data that would need to be incorporated into such an inventory. And then I think the other aspect to consider is what's the sort of appropriate level for regulatory intervention in terms of municipalities don't have control over airport operations necessarily. So oftentimes our climate work tends to focus on what can the municipalities actually control. But with that said, airports are controlled by the state. Massport is a quasi state-run agency that oversees Logan, oversees Hanscom Air Force Base, and so are there state-level greenhouse accounting frameworks that we can think about that could maybe capture aviation emissions on a way that individual municipal inventories can't? And if the state is the one who has that regulatory authority over the airports anyway, maybe that's the scale for intervention. So again, not my area of expertise, but I'm happy to continue the conversation with Park and anyone who's interested.
Any other questions? Okay, one last question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, earlier you mentioned urban planning as a negotiation for better communities. So I was curious, who are like the parties that it's most difficult to negotiate with in your work at MAPC when furthering projects or initiatives?
Yeah, it sometimes depends on the project or the issue at hand. Sometimes, it might be with the municipality. You might, municipality might approach you about a project, and we as an agency, I think, are very clear about wanting to root our work in equity and in climate. And sometimes we get pushback around some of those things from the municipal client that wants to work with us. And so that can sometimes be a delicate navigation in terms of how can you make sure you're staying true to your values, but also meet the municipality where they're at, or how do you bring them along as part of that conversation. So that's one aspect. Sometimes it can be challenges with community partners. There was one instance where we were doing some advocacy around low-income fare issues, and then there's some community grassroots organizations that were also advocating for the low-income fare issue, but they felt like there's some strategic differences of opinion, and so they kind of confronted us about some of those differences in a way that was maybe a bit more intense than I was expecting. And then after some conversations, we were able to kind of diffuse that a bit, but it was a little tense. So it can definitely depend on the moment or the issue that's involved. It can sometimes come from a municipality, it sometimes can come from a community partner. But I think being able to have that openness and that willingness to listen and have those difficult conversations is really critical. And one thing that I think has been really interesting for me, kind of coming from the nonprofit advocacy space, but then moving into this public sector government role, is I understand kind of the perspective of where advocates are coming from. And so I can find those opportunities for us to be aligned on policy issues, and even if we might diverge strategically on some things, we can have that dialogue about how do we navigate that. So I would say it plays out on different levels depending on the issue at hand, and it can be from the municipality side or the community side.